George Harrison handed Eric Clapton a guitar in 1973 and said nothing. The room fell into a tense silence, but it wasn't awkward. It was electric. The air vibrated with the weight of unspoken words, the history of betrayal and obsession. Everyone present knew that what followed wouldn't be a friendly jam session. It was a duel. 2 hours of blistering, wordless confrontation, each note a declaration, each chord a challenge. Their fingers danced across frets and strings with surgical precision, a war waged in melody instead of fists. Clapton's riffs clawed at the air like lightning, but George's melodic precision and subtle genius held its ground. By the end, the onlookers had made up their minds. Eric had won this round, but the storm that brewed that day had roots long before. 3 years earlier, Clapton had confessed his obsession over George's wife. The confession wasn't met with forgiveness. It was met with chaos. George, meanwhile, had discovered his own wife entangled with someone dangerously close. Letters were written, lies spun, and the legendary song Layla emerged as both confession and weapon. The betrayal didn't just end a marriage. It fractured the Beatles' circle forever, leaving scars that would never truly heal. George Harrison was born on February 25, 1943, in a tiny house at 12 Arnold Grove, Liverpool. The house was modest, to the extreme, no garden, an outdoor toilet, and a single coal fire for warmth. His father, Harold, worked as a bus conductor and had once been a steward on ships, while his mother, Louise, assisted at a local shop. Louise, while pregnant, would often tune the radio to faraway music from India. The sound of sitars and tablas, drifting through the freezing air of Wavertree, wasn't just a passing whim. It was a seed. A small, almost imperceptible sound that would later shape the trajectory of George's life. In January 1950, when George was nearly 7, the family moved to a council house. It was larger, but still modest. 6 years later, in 1956, a pivotal moment arrived. George's mother bought him a used Dutch-Aid Eggman acoustic guitar for 310 shillings, roughly $110 today. It was cheap, unremarkable, and yet to George it was the key to another world. A family friend showed him simple songs, and George practiced relentlessly, pouring his small, growing heart into the frets. That very guitar, decades later, would sell for over $800,000 at auction, even without its original machine heads, a testament not to its craftsmanship, but to the man who had poured his soul into it. Around the same time, George had another life-changing moment. While riding his bike through the neighborhood, he heard a voice unlike anything he had ever known. Elvis Presley singing "Heartbreak Hotel" from a radio in a nearby house. At 12 or 13, the sound struck him like lightning. Some say he even crashed his bike in sheer distraction. From that day on, guitars consumed his thoughts. He drew them endlessly in school books and later admitted, "I was totally into guitars." Music wasn't a hobby, it was oxygen. By March 1958, George had made a decisive choice. At 16, he left school and began working at Blackers, a department store in Liverpool. By day, he learned the wiring trade as an apprentice electrician. By night, he was immersed in music, practicing with his band, The Rebels. He was living two lives, one of mundane labor, the other of electric dreams. Though the job at Blackers didn't last long, it provided the means to buy better gear, the tools of a burgeoning musician. 1960 marked George's first journey with the Beatles to Hamburg, Germany. The clubs were rough, loud, and unrelenting, filled with drunken patrons and chaos. But George didn't care. He had music to master. There was only one problem. He was underage and had falsified his passport. On November 20th, 1960, a jealous club owner reported him, and the next day, George was deported with nothing but one amplifier, a battered suitcase, and his guitar. The setback did not deter him. It fueled the fire. August 16th, 1962 brought another seismic shift. Pete Best was abruptly fired from the Beatles. It happened in Brian Epstein's record shop at 10 a.m. George, John, and Paul had already chosen Ringo Starr as the replacement, but Pete was kept in the dark until it was over. Just 10 weeks later, the Beatles recorded "Love Me Do," the snowball that would grow into a global avalanche. Pete Best missed it all by mere weeks, an unfortunate footnote in rock history. By August 1963, George was holed up in a Bournemouth hotel room, feeling sick, bored, and restless. While lying in bed, he picked up his tape recorder and wrote his first song, "Don't Bother Me." Initially, it was merely an experiment, a test to see if he could create anything at all. That song made it onto the With the Beatles album released on November 22, 1963, marking George's quiet but undeniable emergence as a songwriter. But despite this early success, nearly 2 years passed before another George composition was included on a Beatles record. By 1964, the Beatles' whirlwind tour schedule had become relentless, 32 shows in 24 cities over 33 days. Ringo collapsed with a 102-degree fever and had to be temporarily replaced. George, who had wanted to cancel the tour for the band's health, found his concerns overruled by management. The stress of non-stop performances threatened to push the group into a complete breakdown. April 5, 1965, while filming Help, at Twickenham Studios, George saw a sitar for the first time. It was sitting idle in the background of a restaurant scene. By August, after speaking with David Crosby, George began studying the sitar seriously under Ravi Shankar's guidance. By October, he used it on Norwegian wood, marking the first time a sitar had been incorporated into Western pop music. Ravi Shankar, initially skeptical of George's playing, would come to acknowledge that a new sound, an entirely new dimension of music, had been born. By 1966, George was increasingly isolated. Lennon and McCartney dominated songwriting, and George's fascination with Indian philosophy and LSD made him feel distant. Frustrations came to a head on January 10, 1969, during the Get Back sessions, when George suddenly declared, "I'm leaving the band, walking out for 5 days." He later cited Paul's bossiness and John's heroin use as catalysts. That brief departure nearly tore the Beatles apart. Meanwhile, across London, Eric Clapton's life followed a dramatically different path. Born on March 30, 1945, in Surrey, Eric's mother, Patricia, was just 16. His father, a Canadian soldier, left before Eric's birth. To shield the family from shame, Eric was raised to believe his grandmother was his mother and Patricia merely an older sister. The truth emerged when he was 9, shattering his sense of family and leaving a void that music would later fill. For his 13th birthday in 1958, Eric received a Hoyer guitar with steel strings, difficult to play and initially abandoned in favor of cycling. By 15, he returned to the instrument with obsessive dedication, practicing for hours each day, recording himself on a reel-to-reel tape machine, listening and perfecting every nuance. Guitar was no longer a pastime, it was his lifeline. In 1961, Eric was expelled from Kingston College of Art after a single year. He had neglected assignments entirely, consumed by music. In January 1963, at 17, he joined the blues group The Roosters. The band rehearsed incessantly in small London pubs, but the short-lived experience taught him the chaos of band life. By October 1963, he joined the Yardbirds at 18. Their single, For Your Love, released in March 1965, reached number 1, but Eric felt it betrayed the essence of blues. Days before the chart success, he quit, choosing authenticity over fame. In the mid-1960s, Clapton's life spiraled into both brilliance and darkness. In 1966, he formed Cream with Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker, heralded as rock's first supergroup. The music was revolutionary, but the internal violence between Bruce and Baker was constant. One night, Baker nearly killed Bruce during a drum solo. On another, he drew a knife. Despite this, Cream released Disraeli Gears in 1967, including the legendary Sunshine of Your Love, cementing Clapton's legend. But fame came at a steep cost. Non-stop touring, substance abuse, and unrelenting pressure pushed Clapton to the brink. He developed a heroin addiction, at one point spending the equivalent of $8,000 per week. In 1982, he collapsed in Minneapolis with bleeding ulcers, a result of decades of abuse. He later reflected, "I was running on empty. I don't know how I survived the 70s." By 1968, Cream's farewell tour was toxic. Clapton, trapped in the year was 1973 and tension hung thick in a London studio. George Harrison and Eric Clapton faced each other, guitars in hand, and silence filled the space like a living thing. This was no casual session. Every eye in the room was fixed on the two men, aware that this duel carried far more than mere musical pride. It was the culmination of years of obsession, betrayal, and unresolved tension. The air buzzed with anticipation as fingers touched strings and notes began to slice through the quiet. Clapton's playing was raw, urgent, a storm of emotion, while George's style was precise, spiritual, restrained yet cutting. The duel stretched for hours, a private war fought in melody, harmony, and the spaces between. Each note was a conversation, each chord a challenge, and every passing moment revealed the depth of their intertwined histories. By the end, there was no argument about the winner. Eric had claimed the victory. But no one walked away untouched, and the silent aftermath carried the weight of decades of secrets. Those secrets traced back to the letters, the whispers, and the tangled web of personal betrayals that had begun years earlier. Eric's confession of obsession over George's wife had not gone unnoticed, and George had suffered his own heartbreak in discovering an intimate betrayal with someone he had once trusted above all. The letters, the veiled apologies, and the songs that followed, most famously Layla, were more than artistic expressions. They were weapons, cries, and records of human frailty laid bare. That hidden history set the stage for every note played in the duel, every tension-filled glance, and every lingering silence. George Harrison's spiritual and musical journey only deepened the complexity of the duel. His immersion in Indian philosophy and meditation had transformed not only his life but also the sound of rock music itself. The sitar, learned under the tutelage of Ravi Shankar, had become an extension of his consciousness, an instrument of both musical and spiritual exploration. The world heard George's innovations in tracks like Norwegian Wood and Within You Without You. But behind the notes were hours of practice, reflection, and personal evolution. This was a man constantly reaching beyond the ordinary, seeking purity in sound, in life, and in the turbulent seas of human relationships. Meanwhile, Eric Clapton's journey had been a battle against personal demons that threatened to consume him entirely. By the time he joined Cream, his talent had already been tempered by heartbreak, abandonment, and the relentless pursuit of authenticity. The formation of Cream brought not just fame but chaos. Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker's explosive tempers turned rehearsals into minefields. One night, Baker nearly attacked Bruce with a knife during a drum solo, and yet, despite this constant storm, music emerged that would define an era. Sunshine of Your Love became a testament to brilliance born in adversity, yet the personal cost was almost unbearable. Heroin and alcohol became tools to dull the pain, sustain the pace, and survive the relentless expectations of fame. For Eric, addiction was not just a struggle, it was a companion, a thief, and ultimately, a teacher. As the 1970s unfolded, Cream disbanded, leaving behind both a musical legacy and a trail of personal chaos. Financial mismanagement by their manager, Robert Stigwood, ensured that fame did not equal fortune. Tours were grueling, tensions remained high, and Clapton's physical and mental health deteriorated under the strain. By the early 1980s, the cumulative weight of years on heroin and alcohol led to a near-fatal collapse. 3 bleeding ulcers mixed with bottles of brandy and codeine nearly ended his life in Minneapolis. He later reflected on this period with grim honesty. "I was running on empty. I don't know how I survived the 70s. Yet even in the depths of despair, music remained a lifeline, a bridge between chaos and purpose." Back in the Beatles' orbit, George Harrison continued navigating the turbulent waters of fame, friendship, and personal integrity. The Beatles' final years were fraught with conflict, largely rooted in differing ambitions, artistic visions, and personal habits. During the Get Back sessions of 1969, George walked out, exhausted by Paul's domineering tendencies and John's heroin-induced detachment. That brief departure nearly fractured the band completely. Despite these tensions, George's music continued to evolve, his spiritual path informing both his compositions and his interactions with the world. Songs like All Things Must Pass would later reveal a depth of introspection, a confrontation with loss, love, and betrayal that few in rock history had articulated so powerfully. The intersection of George and Eric's lives was not merely coincidence, it was fate threaded through the lens of obsession, creativity, and human desire. Their rivalry, both private and public, reflected the intense pressures of genius. Clapton's unrelenting pursuit of authenticity and George's spiritual perfectionism collided in both subtle and explosive ways. The duel of 1973 was a crystallization of decades of personal and professional turbulence, and it revealed that music could be as ferocious a battlefield as any physical confrontation. Even outside the studios and stages, both men's lives were shaped by personal relationships that burned with intensity. George's marriage, punctuated by betrayal and forgiveness, mirrored the duality of human emotion. Love intertwined with pain, obsession with devotion. Eric's own romantic life, similarly tumultuous, intersected with professional partnerships in ways that created both inspiration and devastation. Letters, whispered confessions, and public statements became both documentation and weaponry, leaving marks on their psyches that would persist long after the final notes were played. Through all this, the influence of their musical innovations radiated outward. George's integration of Indian instruments and philosophy reshaped Western music, while Clapton's fiery guitar work and dedication to blues authenticity influenced generations of musicians. Their lives illustrate how personal struggle, genius, and rivalry can coexist, producing art that resonates far beyond the individuals who create it. Each chord, each melody, each song carried with it fragments of their complex histories, emotional truths rendered into sound. The legacy of George Harrison and Eric Clapton is inseparable from the intensity of their experiences. Music for both men was never just entertainment. It was survival, confrontation, confession, and transcendence. Their stories intertwine in ways that reveal the cost of obsession and the brilliance that emerges from it. The duel in 1973, the letters, the betrayals, and the legendary songs are all chapters in a narrative about human vulnerability and artistic genius. The world saw the talent, the public read the headlines, but only the music fully captured the depths of what they endured. The battles fought silently in hotel rooms, studios, and the private recesses of the heart. Even today, the echoes of their rivalry and friendship resonate. New generations of musicians study the precision, emotion, and innovation embedded in their recordings. The story of George Harrison handing Eric Clapton a guitar is told and retold, not as a tale of competition alone, but as a window into the complexity of genius. It is a reminder that behind every celebrated performance lies a history of struggle, betrayal, obsession, and resilience. George Harrison and Eric Clapton did not merely play music, they conversed, fought, and healed through it. Their instruments became extensions of themselves, capable of expressing emotion words could not. From a small Liverpool house to the greatest stages in the world, from betrayal to reconciliation, from addiction to artistic triumph, their lives intersected in ways that defined an era. The duel of 1973, the personal scandals, and the innovations in sound were not isolated incidents. They were the culmination of decades of pain, perseverance, and passion. Ultimately, their stories remind us that genius is rarely without conflict. Behind every chord, every lyric, every note of brilliance lies a human story of struggle, longing, and the relentless pursuit of perfection. Harrison and Clapton, through rivalry and friendship, heartbreak and triumph, created music that transcends time. Their legacy is one of confrontation and collaboration, obsession and devotion, showing that the most profound art often arises from the most intense personal journeys. Theirs was a world where music replaced fists, where chords became confessions, and where the echoes of personal pain transformed into universal genius. And in that world, every listener, every fan, and every future musician could witness the eternal duel of human emotion, meat and history, a duel fought not in newspapers, not in courts, but in the language both men understood best, the raw, unfiltered, unforgettable language of music. After the Beatles' breakup, George Harrison embarked on a solo journey that would define him not just as a guitarist, but as a spiritual and musical visionary. All Things Must Pass, released in 1970, was more than an album. It was a confessional, a chronicle of grief, betrayal, and ultimate resilience. Songs like My Sweet Lord revealed the depth of his spiritual devotion, blending Indian influences with Western rock in ways that no one had dared before. Yet success did not erase old wounds. George carried the shadow of past betrayals, the tension with Paul and John, and the ghosts of what could have been. Even in his most triumphant moments, the weight of history lingered, echoing in his melodies and subtle guitar solos. Meanwhile, Eric Clapton's solo career was a landscape of both brilliance and chaos. His albums captured the raw intensity that had defined Cream, but were now tempered by a personal struggle for redemption. Music became a therapy, a tether to sanity, and a proving ground for genius reclaimed from addiction. Their solo paths, though separate, mirrored the same themes of obsession, heartbreak, and the relentless pursuit of perfection. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the shadows of old rivalries resurfaced. Public appearances, studio sessions, and sporadic collaborations often brought George and Eric back into each other's orbits. Sometimes peacefully, sometimes with the tension of old grudges simmering beneath the surface. Fans and journalists speculated endlessly. Would they reconcile fully, or were they forever destined to compete, note by note, chord by chord? One studio session in 1979 encapsulated the intensity perfectly. Clapton's fiery licks met George's restrained yet spiritually charged playing, producing a sound that was equal parts confrontation and communion. Through music, they expressed what words could not: admiration, resentment, love, and betrayal, all simultaneously. These sessions became legendary, stories retold by those lucky enough to witness them firsthand, cementing the notion that genius often demands both rivalry and camaraderie. By the 1980s and 1990s, both men had endured enough pain to recognize the fleeting nature of life and fame. George Harrison, ever the philosopher, embraced meditation and charity work, quietly influencing generations of musicians and fans alike. He survived a near-fatal stabbing in 1999, a stark reminder of the fragility that had always shadowed his brilliance. Clapton, having wrestled with addiction and the personal costs of fame, began mentoring younger musicians,